Hey everyone, I'm Tiff,
And I'm Sarah.
and we're here to talk to you today about frame. We've mentioned frame briefly when we talk about wearing your cape to make sure that certain moves are working smoothly. We wanted to take a deep dive into that concept and talk more about what's really happening.
So the first thing we're going to talk about is what frame actually is. Like, what does that entail with your body? So we've talked about with your cape, your shoulders come down and back like a big cape is flowing down your back, like super swing dancers. So keeping that idea, when our shoulders come down and back, everything's in alignment. Our shoulders, over our hips, over our feet. And that's really your goal right there. So using our back muscles, we're using all of these muscles in through here to bring those shoulders down and back so that they stay there and that they stop us from overextending our shoulder and going too far, which could hurt us. Another way you can think about it is your shoulder blades squeezing together. Now you don't want to overextend and push your chest out. Again, you're looking for that straight alignment. So you don't want to be slouched, but you don't want to overextend. Another thing you can talk about, you want to think about, is your core. So we want our core to be active or engaged. A great way to think about that is like if you're lying on the ground and a big dog is about to jump on you, you brace for that impact. And that's what you want to think about with your core. If our core isn't engaged at all, then our upper body can move and do whatever. Whereas if our core is engaged, we're moving more as one because our hips are connected to our torso, which is connected to our shoulders. So like if Tim were to push on my arm, everything moves together instead of just my arm or just my upper body. So we want the whole thing connected so that moves can go from our fingertips all the way down through our toes. We also want to keep our arms loose. We're going to talk about this a little bit, but we have a dynamic connection, which means that our arms don't just stay in place the whole time. So we want a solid hand connection. So we want our hands to be able to hang on to our partner. Otherwise, we're not dancing with each other because there's no connection. But we want our arms nice and loose so that they can change, and then our shoulders down and back. So this is the goal. Arms loose, hand engaged, shoulder engaged. This is something that takes practice, thinking about that connection head to toe, especially if it's something you've never done before. I like to think about it when I'm just sitting around doing something, kind of sit up for a second, think about that posture. This is kind of what people say, what you think of when you talk about good posture, is having that aligned stance. So I'll hold that for a little bit, and then maybe relax it for a little while. And then later on, think about engaging that again and keeping everything aligned. This is one of those things where the more you practice it, the more kind of muscle memory it'll be, and it'll be easier to just kind of go into it when you're dancing.
As you begin to play around and experiment with those sorts of muscles and the idea of frame, you'll notice that there are two different extremes that you can sort of tend towards. There is a tight frame and a loose frame. In general, people fall somewhere along the spectrum between those two. I like to dance with a little bit more of a tight frame. Sarah likes to dance with a little bit more of a loose frame. A tight frame, we like to use the description of a really thick rubber band. So it still has some flexibility, but when you try and stretch it out, it doesn't really go very far. A tight frame in a swing out looks something like this. Compare that to a more loose frame where you've got a thinner rubber band, much stretchier and much more flexible, which looks something like this. That's one thing that's sort of unique about swing dancing is that it has a dynamic frame versus something that's more static. An example of a dance that has a more static frame is something like waltz. What's great about being able...
Keep going and cut it out.
Okay.
Because I think I can do that. I think.
One thing that having that dynamic frame can be useful for is signaling specific moves. For instance, something like a 4-count move. We're going to be talking about these 4-count moves on Thursday, so look forward to it. They'll be much quicker and much snappier, so having a tight connection is really important for those. Having a dynamic connection or dynamic frame also allows you to respond to your partner better. As I said earlier, Sarah likes to dance with a more loose connection, and as a lead, it's good practice to be accommodating to your partner. So we usually meet somewhere in the middle. I'll loosen up, Sarah will tighten up a little bit, and we'll find some common ground on something that works for both of us.
It always depends on whoever you're dancing with. It's going to change with every single person you dance with. So followers, I will change my connection to my leader a lot, especially depending on whether they're a very tight leader, because I will tighten up my connection, especially to protect myself. If I have a leader who's leading a lot of moves and maybe not giving me so much space, then I will tighten up my connection to make sure that I'm getting through all of the moves and doing them and listening without hurting myself or like getting left behind. So I'll specifically do a lighter or a heavier connection, that tighter connection, so that I can be extra responsive. So that, okay, you're doing a lot of moves, I'm going to tighten up my connection to make sure I'm responding to all of these moves. Whereas sometimes I dance with a leader who gives me a lot of space. This is more along the lines of how we teach. And then, you know, if we're dancing, I can go, oh, hey, let's do this. And have a little bit more freedom with that loose connection to break from it and do other stuff instead of just doing a lot of moves. And so I suggest you really pay attention to what your leader is doing, and you can adjust your connection to respond to that so that you can dance and especially not get hurt. If a leader has a really tight connection and they're doing a lot of different moves, then they may not be listening to what you're doing, and if you loosen up, something might happen. So we want to make sure that you're paying attention to your partner and that you're adjusting accordingly.
One of the most common ways that dance injuries can occur is when you break your frame. An example of this would be if we're doing a swing out, and as we're extending the last 4 counts, so step, triple, 5, 6, 7, 8. My shoulder broke the frame here, and because I don't have all those muscles sort of activated keeping it in place, it's a lot more prone to injury.
Yeah. We call finding this the end of your line. So when you're in open position, you're always looking for the end of your line, and that's the end of your frame. So this is as far away from Tim as I can get without breaking that frame, without letting go of my shoulder or rounding my back or something like that. So that's what you want to be conscious of when you're dancing, is where the end of the line is. And say if Tim is going backwards, I might need to go forwards to adjust to that, and vice versa. So that's another part of paying attention to your partner, is finding the end of your line and not going too far past that. And that's something that comes with practice. So try different things, like what happens if you don't go far enough? Then you've got lots of extra space. What happens if you go to the end of the line? What happens if you go too far? So that's a really great thing to practice. And then one more thing for followers specifically, since we're usually doing a lot of the turns with our arms up, is thinking about having a looser arm, generally, unless you think you're going to get hurt. If we do an inside turn or something, or some sort of turn, when I'm here, if my frame is really tight, my leader literally cannot lift my arm. So it's kind of got a little bit of an effect of like, oh, you're doing a turn, okay, and then letting go of that frame. So one thing that's good to practice is keeping that frame, but generally having your arm loose enough that it can respond to something like a turn without you having to go tight, 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 oh wait, loose, okay. No. And again, the exception is to that is if you think you're going to get hurt. And then, like we always say, when you are turning with your arm up, you want to have your elbow somewhere in your line of sight so that it doesn't pull on your shoulder.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's Technique Tuesday. We look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Yay!